I am so excited to go on this adventure with you. Together, we're going to find out how we got from Jesus in the manger to all of these churches, denominations, and Christian ideas that we have today. It's a long, very strange trip we're going to take, but I think it is important for our faith to understand where we came from, to understand where the Bible came from, to understand who these people that we turn to in our scriptures really were. We're going to walk through Luke and Acts because basically it's one book in two parts. Luke tells us the story of Jesus, who he was, where he came from, and what he did. And Acts tells us what happened as soon as he was gone, what all of his crew did as soon as he was taken up to heaven and they were all on their own. And from there, it'll be very easy to understand as the timeline evolves why things happen the way they did. Along the way, as I'm reading the scripture, I'm going to show you some information off to the side that'll help you understand the connections between the Old Testament and the New. I'm going to give you some Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic words so that you can kind of go, oh, that's what they were saying. And I'm going to show you some other pictures and things that I think of every time I read. But before we do that, we need to really understand what historical context means. These people lived in a completely different time. Their lives were so different from our lives today that it's very hard to kind of imagine what it was like to be them. But I think it's important. The more you know about them, the easier it is to read and understand why they made the choices that they did. So before we go into Luke next week, let's take a quick trip back into Nazareth in Jesus' time. Some of the pictures that I'm going to show are from some people that I know, but also some of them are from a place called Nazareth Village, which is located where Nazareth was, and you can go visit it. But I know not everyone can go visit it, so I'm going to show you some of the pictures of what they've done now. They've reconstructed the village as it was in Jesus' time. Nazareth is a small, or was a very small farming town, between 200 and 400 people during this period. That's not a lot. So that meant everyone knew everyone, and everyone was up in everybody's business. They lived more as a community than individual families. And so the women and the men disciplined all the children and taught all the children. They kind of were like a tribe more than a community. And that's important to understand. Nazareth is an olive farm, basically. At least that's what surrounded the village. Trees were imported and they began to grow, and they still grow there today. Some of them are over 100 years old. When you look at an old olive tree, you'll see around the base these little shoots that come up. These shoots are called Nazereths, which in Hebrew means an olive shoot or a new tree growing off of an old one. This is where Nazareth gets its name from. That's important because way back in that Old Testament, Isaiah tells us that the Savior will be a shoot off the root of Jesse. So Jesus coming from Nazareth made complete sense to everyone because Nazareth was the shoot coming off the rod of Jesse's olive tree. Let's take a quick peek at a house in Nazareth. Houses were more like apartments because they were built kind of together with shared walls. They generally had one room, two if you were fancy and rich. And within that room, kind of everything happened. It was an empty space, and if they were cooking, they'd pull out the table. If they were sleeping, they'd pull out their cots and then put everything away. Because the rooms were so small, very little of life took place inside. Most of it took place outside. But when they were inside, they were gathered in close quarters as a family. One of the things that you could find in every house was a cooking pit, and the fancier ones, kind of an oven, because every day, everyone had to cook. There were no microwave dinners. There were no grocery stores. This was before electricity, before indoor plumbing, before propane gas. None of that. So these fire pits kind of were the center of where women gathered in the home to prepare all of the meals. Most of what they ate came from the farmland, and in Nazareth, fishing. Meat was scarce and rare. They did have eggs and milk, which they would make cheese, but most of their diet consisted on what they could find. And mostly that was fish and veggies. We know this because they also had these weird toilet rooms. They would be around the village. If you had a really fancy house, you had your own, although most people still went outside of the village walls. In these toilet rooms, as you can see, there were these like limestone little seats with pits in the middle, and all of everything would go down into tunnels about 10 feet deep. Today, we actually are able to go back and dig in these tunnels to figure out what they ate and what their lives were like, which is kind of weird, but in a way kind of cool. In the village, outside of the houses and the farmland and where they kept the animals, there was a synagogue. And the synagogue today is built on top of the very same place the synagogue was back then and reconstructed very similarly. Synagogues back then were kind of also all-purpose rooms. They were built with these concrete kind of bleachers around them, so everyone would sit looking across the room at other people. There was no pulpit that people looked at. Instead, they looked at the center of the room. In these synagogues, everything happened. You would go there on the Sabbath to listen to people discuss Torah and to discuss Torah if you were one of the rabbis or teachers. If you were a rabbi or teacher, you also invited all of the boys to come in and you taught school several days a week. They also were the courtrooms. If you got in trouble, you'd get dragged to the synagogue, and that's where everyone would gather to figure out how you were going to be punished. And they were sometimes makeshift hospitals, or if someone was coming through town, that's where they would let them stay. And they also were like community centers. Everything happened inside the synagogue if it involved more than a couple of families. So what was a day like in Nazareth? Well, for little boy Jesus, for Mary, for Joseph, it was pretty much the same thing every day, except on certain occasions where they'd go into the temple. On those religious holidays, the whole group, all 200 to 400 of them, except those who couldn't travel, would take off. But on days where they were just regular days, it looked like this. You'd wake up in the morning and do your morning prayer. And then everyone would start kind of getting ready for the day. They'd start doing their early chores, and for the women, that consisted of making breakfast. Only they didn't eat breakfast first thing. They broke their fast in the middle of the day. So they'd pack up simple meals, normally bread and cheese and a couple of olives, for them to carry with them. And then they leave the house to do what they do. If you were a little boy, 5 until your bar mitzvah, you would go into the synagogue and sit and listen to people read the Torah and discuss with you what each thing meant. And you do a lot of memorization. If you were a little girl, you'd stay with your mother and you'd start learning how to manage the house. You also would be studying your Torah. In fact, the women around you would be kind of quizzing you and talking to you about it, and you do the same thing with your younger siblings and friends. Men and women all had jobs. There were no stay-at-home moms in Nazareth. Jobs were things like you maybe pressed the wine, which meant stomping on it with your feet on a big rock right outside of town. Maybe you gathered olives. You might be not really a carpenter, but more like a mason, because most of what was done had to do with brick and dirt more than wood. There was very little wood that was used except for maybe in furniture. So maybe you were maybe you were a mason. Perhaps you were a weaver who helped make all the clothes for everybody. Perhaps you made the cheese. Everyone had different jobs that contributed to the whole village, and you spent your days doing that job. About midday, everyone would break for midday prayers. And then they would eat that very simple lunch, and then they would carry on. As the boys came back from the synagogue, then in the afternoon, a lot of times the kids would play, because kids are kids. And they would play things like checkers and dice and board games, like you can see. They also would roll hoops, and they had whistles. And although there would be no pictures or images in the house, because they don't believe in putting up images of themselves, little girls were allowed to have dolls. So the little girls would practice caring for the children with their dolls. It was the only kind of image that we ever have found. So after everyone was finished playing and finished with their daily duties, they would gather for a really hearty meal. Normally lentil or vegetable soup, occasionally fish like fried tilapia, and also lots of fruits, cheeses, and bread. In Nazareth, it was probably normally barley bread. Wheat was used on special occasions because it was more expensive, so they would eat barley bread. Their diets were very much restricted by the religious laws of the time. So they followed those very closely. They were very kosher, and so their meals reflected that. Then they'd have evening prayers, and then there was no TV, no movie theater to go to. So what they did most of the time was sit around and read and discuss the Torah. Can you imagine what your life would be like if you woke up every morning and as a group prayed in the middle of the day, spent your whole day learning about the Bible, and then spent your evening free time, fun time, discussing and talking about it? When we say their lives were completely devoted to God, we mean almost every moment of every day. What they ate, how they acted, what they wore, everything was to set them aside or apart for God. As we look at the people in Nazareth, we see a people who truly, completely relied on God and were waiting for Him to talk to them, waiting for Him to ask them to step up to the plate. When we look at what happens to Mary and Joseph and Elizabeth and all these people, when we jump into Luke, I want you to remember that this was their life. It was the biggest thing that could have happened to them. It was like their team winning the Super Bowl, or being elected to Supreme Court justice when you got named to be the rabbi, or everything. God was their everything. Try to spend some time this week imagining what it was like for that little girl Mary, who sat in this village, playing with her friends, learning from her mother and father, and spending her days in one of these houses devoted to God. I will see you next week. You don't need to bring anything. I'm going to literally read the Bible to you. I can't wait to jump in.